Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Big box retailers, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a bill in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. Senate Bill 1838 would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, visit handsoffmyrewards.com and tell them to oppose credit card routing legislation paid for by the Electronic Payments Coalition.
It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you a fist pumper, a woo-hooer, a hand clapper, a high fiver? I kind of like the high five, but if you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. At ChumbaCasino.com, choose from hundreds of social casino-style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses. So don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock and The Pavilion with Stephen Wallace. In each show, Stephen will interview someone connected to the world of horse racing or cricket.
Hello everyone. With Cheltenham over, the focus now turns to Aintree and the Grand National. Joining us today is sportswriter David Owen, who has just written a book about the 1975 Grand National winner, L'Escargot, the horse that foiled Red Rum. Thanks for joining me, David.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Steve.
What prompted you to write No Snail, a book about L'Escargot, Grand National winner and dual Cheltenham Gold Cup winner?
Well, I was looking for a good story ever since the previous racing book I did about Foynhaven. And it was just a gradual accumulation of facts about L'Escargot. I realized what a good story he was. It's not just the 75 Grand National. He's one of only two horses to have won the Gold Cup as well. And there was also an American angle, which is quite unusual for British and Irish racehorses. He ran in some good races in the United States. He was also owned by an interesting character, Raymond Guest, who used to be the US ambassador to Ireland. And his trainer was interesting as well. Both Guest and Dan Moore, the trainer in Ireland, were desperate to win a Grand National for the best part of half a century, both of them. And in 1975, their dream finally came true. So it's a combination of all those things. And I actually couldn't believe nobody had written a book either about L'Escargot himself or even about Tommy Carberry, his jockey, who was, as you know, a tremendous horse. The combination of all those three things, all those things, really.
You must have been reading my prompt cards here. Hey, and well, you were a fan of the Grand National as well, because obviously the dream of winning the 1975 race.
Yeah. Yes. I find myself drawn to endurance. Some people like, sprint, fast and furious. I like things like marathons, the Tour de France, and obviously the Grand National falls into that category. So yes, I am drawn by the Grand National. There are so many stories, and almost every year there's something. It's a bit of a cliche to say that, but last year with Sam Worley-Cohen winning on his last ride, it sort of falls into this pattern of stories that you get from the race year after year. And the other thing I like about horse racing is the way that horse, it's almost like the center of its own mini solar system, because you've got lots of people oriented around it. You've got the owner, the trainer, jockey, the rivals, the people who've bet on it. And these sort of things are always slightly shifting. I find that absolutely fascinating, the people it throws together and the sort of shifting alliances, things like that. I find racing is one of the best sports for story. Grand National is probably the list for races.
Well, let's talk about the 1975 Grand National. When L'Escargot foiled Red Rum in his quest to win 3 Grand Nationals in a row. How had preparations gone for L'Escargot ahead of that 1975 race gone?
Well, he was very much a veteran by that time. Realistically, there was no other good race he was going to win because he wasn't fast enough anymore. So unlike most of his previous seasons, he had just been aimed exclusively at this race. So he'd had, I think, only about 5 races the whole year, hadn't performed particularly brilliantly in any of them, but was just being gradually geared up for this race. They also had a bit of luck because unlike the previous 2 years when Red Rum had won, it was a dreadful winter weather-wise. And so they had soft ground, helped them a lot when taking on Red Rum because Lescargo that year was carrying a lighter weight.
Yeah, Red Rum's carrying 12 stone, Lescargo 11 stone 3. That's
right. Whereas the previous year when Red Rum had beaten him, there was just a £1 difference. So that, and plus the previous year, as I say, it was good ground, which Red Rum really needed carrying 12 stone.
And Red Rum sent off as the 7-2 favourite. Only 31 runners in 1975, and 74 there was 42.
Yeah, we that's before the 40 horse limit, but we've got used in recent years to the race being fully and oversubscribed. But that certainly wasn't the case in those days. There were a lot of problems at Aintree. This 75 race, there was the new owner, Bill Davis, who'd taken over from Mirabel Topham, whose family had control of the race for a decade. There were 1 or 2 Grand Nationals in that sort of period where there weren't even 30 runners, I believe.
And the race itself, he was prominent early on, but made a bad mistake at the 7th fence.
Oh my goodness, yes. It's now known as the Foynhaven fence. It wasn't really. Smallest fence on the course, apart from the water fence. But it's a fence that good jockeys, were quite wary of. Notably, Terry Biddlecombe used to call it the baby hurdle, but he had this theory that, especially as it came after Beeches, horses didn't respect it. And it's surprising how many horses have had problems there over the years. Lescargo, obviously, he'd already jumped it several times in his previous Grand National attempts, but for whatever reason, he hit it very hard in this 1975 race. And there's a still photograph that was taken of a stride or 2 after he hit the fence. Carberry is really just about to tumble over the horse's head. His calf, his left calf, you can see, is parallel to the ground. It really is extraordinary how he managed to stay on. Really, the skin of their teeth that they kept going. It could have ruined everything. It really could. It knocked him out of his rhythm for quite a while in the race. He dropped back to sort of 7th, 8th, 9th for quite a while after that.
But with 3 fences to jump, Red Rum and Lescargo were 1 and 2.
Yeah, they were more or less neck and neck. And if you didn't know the background, you'd think, oh boy, we're coming up for a grandstand finish here. It's gonna, goodness knows what's going to happen. Actually, again, because of the lightweight, because he knew how well his horse was going, Carberry was basically, he knew by then that if his horse jumped the remaining fences, they were very likely to win because he was going so easily. Red Rum had this huge weight. He just knew he had the race in the bag. It was his to lose at that point. There's a story that going over the last fence, Brian Fletcher, Red Rum's jockey, who'd always, for the previous 2 years, he'd had Lescargo down as the main danger to them. There's a story that he just said, going over the last, okay, Tommy, you go on. It's your race. He knew he was beaten. So although it looked very close, the race was more or less done by then, as long as he didn't make a mistake in the last two or three. They'd always been very careful not to let Escargot take the lead too early in his races, because like a lot of horses, he tended to stop racing at that point once he was in front.
But he eventually won by 15 lengths.
Yeah, well, as I say, that's when the weight difference really, really came into its own. He between the last fence and the elbow is more or less where he put the distance between them. You think, Red Rum is, I think, universally regarded as the best Grand National horse there's ever been. And, he put 10 lengths between them in a few hundred yards. It's quite an achievement, really.
Well, he was a remarkable horse. But I'd like to go back. You mentioned him earlier, Raymond Guest. The owner, the US ambassador to Ireland at the time. How did he come to buy Escargot for 3,000 guineas?
There was an Irish horseman called Tom Cooper, who he had used a relationship with, because Raymond Guest also owned some very good flat horses, including Derby winners. He'd already won the Derby in 1962 with a horse that Cooper, the man, had found for him. And Cooper found him again.
And why did he get trained by Dan Moore? Did Raymond Guest have other horses with him?
Yes, the first horse of note, at any rate, that he had with Dan Moore was a grey mare called Flying Wild, who, I think I'm right in saying, is the only horse who beat the mighty Arkle twice. She actually won a Massey Ferguson Gold Cup, receiving all sorts of weight, but nonetheless beat him. And in a bumper very early in their career, she didn't win the race, but she finished ahead of Arkle in the race.
And Escargot made his debut on February the 15th, 1967. And one thing I'd like to congratulate you on your book is the excellent stats at the back. They make podcast prompts very, very, very helpful for those.
Yeah, well, I did that particularly with that in mind, Steve.
Obviously, yeah. So he made his debut February the 15th, 1967 on the flat. And he was ridden by Ben Hanbury, future classic winning trainer. How did he come about to be riding Escargot?
He had been down in Sussex with Captain Ryan Price, a very well-known national hunt trainer who, for reasons I won't go into, had been closed down for a while. So there were a lot of Ben Hanbury in the book, a refugee from Sussex. He was basically a refugee. The job that he had to find something else rather quickly. He told me he met Dan Moore in the Irish bar in Cheltenham, and Dan Moore said Dan always called everybody Sonny Boy, even women, but everybody who worked around the yard he called Sonny Boy. And he literally said, "All right, why don't you come over and help us out in Ireland, Sonny Boy, and we'll see how it goes." And he stayed there for a few years, rode a fair few winners for him.
In 1967, Escargot had 6 runs on the flat, 2 wins. In 1968, he then went hurdling and he won at the Cheltenham Festival.
Yeah, he won a division of Gloucestershire Hurdle. They had so many runners in those days that it was just after the foot and mouth epidemic, so the season was completely thrown upside down, and they had very big fields for a while with these horses who hadn't been able to run. The Gloucestershire Hurdle was split into 2 divisions, and he won a division of that. So yeah, absolutely. His first visit to Cheltenham, he was a winner.
Yeah, he was a regular visitor to Cheltenham, wasn't he?
8 times.
A promising hurdler. He then in 1969 ran in the Champion Hurdle, won by Percy Moore.
Which I didn't actually know until I'd started researching this book. But yeah, I mean, I guess the truth is he was a very good novice hurdler, but not quite a top quality hurdler. I think his jumping wasn't quite economical fast enough to be a top hurdler. But I mean, Persian War. Robin Oakley's book about the top 100 racehorses in England and Ireland. I think Persian War he rates Persian War as the very top hurdler of all, from memory, certainly one or two. You race him above Istabrack, for example. So it shows you how good Persian War was. And Night Nurse, he rates him above Night Nurse as well. So this was very, very strong opposition. But nonetheless, I think, certainly he came sixth. He wasn't runner-up. He was second in the betting. He was kind of thought to be Persian War isn't as good as he was the previous year. The obvious alternative was left target. It didn't really work out like that.
They always thought he'd make a better chaser, though.
Yeah, you can just tell from the calendar. I think it's only 3 or 4 weeks after that champion hurdle. He's running in really quite a good steeplechase, the Power Gold Cup, I think it was. In less than a month after the champion hurdle, and he almost won. He came second. So yes, as soon as they could obviously see after that race that he wasn't quite good enough as a hurdler to make it worthwhile continuing. So yeah, Dan Moore, he was known as a trainer of races. But I think it was always on the cards that Lescargo would go chasing relatively early.
Well, he made giant strides as a chaser and winning the Cheltenham Gold Cup in 1970 and 71. But prior to that, he had some trips across to America. What can you tell us about those?
Well, first of all, he went to Belmont Park, which was, this massive venue, almost like a team sports stadium in a way, out on the edge of New York. He won one race there, but then when he entered the most valuable race at the time on the US chasing calendar, he came up. He was close up third. He didn't quite win it. Racing was very different in the US than it was over here because the fences were softer. And so the horses there tended to know very quickly that they could brush through them. So they'd jump low and fast. And obviously, if horse who's used to in Britain and Ireland, it's very different. They then sent him back the following year when something called the Colonial Cup starting, which was a race funded by Marion Scott DuPont, who was DuPont people may have heard of a chemicals company, making gunpowder for the First World War. So her family had become incredibly wealthy. She decided, because steeplechasing was being kicked out of the big cities in the US, it needed a bit of a boost. And so she came up with this, at the time, extraordinary purse of $100,000 for a steeplechase that I think they were hoping would develop into almost a world championship. And this 1970 Colonial Cup, if people look back through the race, they'll see it had the most extraordinary field. It had both Lescargo and French Tan. Crisp came from Australia because they paid the transport fees for quite a lot. And Crisp actually, I don't think ever returned to Australia. He, after the race, he went back to Britain with British horses to join Fred Winter's stable. Toby Balding, I think, sent a horse over. There were some French horses. It was a really absolutely extraordinary field. All the top US chasers of the day were there, and the US, the first three were US horses. Again, conditions being so alien for the Europeans. Gargo was the best European horse, coming fairly close up fourth.
And 1970, as I said, in 1971, he won the Cheltenham Gold Cup. The first year as a 33-1 outsider, and only as a 7-year-old.
Yeah. That's right. No, they didn't really see him coming in 1970. There was a very, very good horse at the time called Kinloch Bray, who was expected to win. He also was owned by Anne Duchess. He raced in the colours made famous by Arkle. But he came down in the race 3 home, and that meant the race was between French Tan and Lescargo, and Lescargo always had his measure. Yeah, 1971 was very different because he was very heavily fancied to win then, partly because a lot of the horses that were supposed to be his main rivals, one after the other, dropped out for all sorts of reasons. So the main alternative fancy in the 71 race was a horse called Leapfrog that the Drapers had, Arkle's old yard. But Leapfrog was a younger horse, and Lescargo, Carberry always had him comfortably in their sights. And I think it was 10 lengths Lescargo won by. It was fairly comfortable in 71, partly because a lot of the paces weren't there.
But he failed in his attempt to become the next Arkle and win the race 3 times in a row.
Yes, that was a very good race in 72. And again, it's only when you sort of go through and watch these things very closely. If you were looking at the race with 2 fences to go, coming down the hill around the bend, he was in pretty much the same position as he'd been in the previous 2, and he just suddenly seemed to run out of gas. He jumped the second last poorly. He was starting to hang right when he jumped. By that time in his career, it took a while for them to correct. And he didn't quite have the speed that he possessed in the 2 previous years. And so, he was just run out of it in the closing stages and ended up 4th. Still just ahead of Chris. It was a really good field, really good race in 1972, won by a mare, Going Carrick Lady, who was a very good horse, ridden by Frank Berry in his first ride at Cheltenham, I think. So that's quite a good start.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Big box retailers, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a bill in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. Senate Bill 1838 would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, visit handsoffmyrewards.com and tell them to oppose credit card routing legislation paid for by the Electronic Payments Coalition.
And after that, the quest then became to win the Grand National. You mentioned it earlier in the podcast, but can you sort of let listeners know the sort of the connection that Raymond Guest and his family had with the Grand National, and Dan Moore?
And Dan Moore, yeah. Well, Raymond Guest was sort of smitten by the race as far back in 1928. His father, although Raymond Guest was American, his father was a British MP who served in the cabinet, succeeded Winston Churchill as aviation minister. This was in the 20s, as I say, and at that time, if you became fashionable and wealthy, you quite often acquired some racehorses. And Guest wasn't really. He was a polo player rather than a horse racer, but at that time he decided he wanted a race and bought a very good horse called Coco, who won the 1926 Cheltenham Gold Cup under someone else's ownership. He had high hopes of winning the 1928 Grand National, and as part of that process, his son became smitten with the race. Not least because the runner-up that year was a bizarre race, actually, won by a 100-to-1 outsider called Trip Prairie Tim. But the only other horse who finished was an American horse, a very good horse, called Billy Barton. And that's when Raymond Guest fell in love with Grand National. Dan Moore, the trainer, 10 years later, the year that Battleship, who we mentioned just now, won. He won basically by a nose from a horse called Royal Danieli. That was as close as he came to winning the Grand National as a jockey. He also desperately wanted a trainer to make up for that. Funnily enough, the jockey who came third in that 1938 race, Jimmy Brogan, was Lescargo's initial owner. So it's funny how these patterns, in retrospect.
So he first ran in the Grand National in 1972. He's brought down. 73, he's third in the famous Red Rum and Crisp race, and second in 1974 Red Rum, until victory in 1975.
Yes, it's quite unusual. Horses often go off the race, and Aintree, with its big, particularly in those days, big dark fences, after a race or two races there, quite a lot of horses have had enough. They don't want to know any. Lescargo was one of those ones. He's almost the opposite. He disliked it, obviously, at first. It gradually appears to have grown on him. Certainly he took it in his stride by the end. It's probably, I would think, another feather in the cap of the trainer, Dan Moore, that he, that process happened.
And at the time, the Grand National is going through a phase when it could be the last Grand National as well.
Yeah, and the uncertainty probably wasn't quite as intense as it was in the 60s. But yes, before the 1975 race, there was another convulsion where Bill Davis, who bought it from the top end, as we said, he was property type, very ambitious man. He had these huge plans for the racecourse, which involved redeveloping it, but also developing the racing side. And he'd given a huge press conference in January or February of that year with huge new plans, including a new £100,000 quote winter derby. Then just before the race, something went wrong with the negotiation, and suddenly it swung from intense optimism to intense pessimism. About a week, there were headlines saying Grand National looks in doubt all over again and things like that. But it was pretty quick. It was pretty quickly over within a week. He also had a horse by then who was intended to run in the race, but very sadly died on the beach within a few days of the race, just while he was training. Yeah, a very strange lead up to the race. And partly as a result of that, this extraordinary sporting occasion where a local horse would be going, a Red Rum, that is, not Lescargo, a local horse would be going to achieve something that had never been achieved in history, winning a third straight race. There are only, people usually say 8,000 or 9,000. I think more accurate, it's probably about 12,000 at the race. It was very, very poorly attended, that Grand National. It's such a shame, because it would have been even more of a shame had Red Rum had got his hat trick that year. But it was an extraordinary race with, Lescargo, Red Rum, and the third horse, Spanish Steps, as well. They're all sort of regarded as all-time greats of the race. People, by and large, if you ask people for their sort of Grand National within living memory, let's say, they by and large come up with the 73 duel, but 75 is not far behind. It really was a very high quality race.
I love the footnotes that you regularly feature in the book, and they really add a lot to it. I must be a bit of a nerd, but one of the other things that really caught my eye was after the race, Bruce Hobbs, the 17-year-old who rode Battleship to win in 1938, he sent a telegram to Dan Moore. Yeah,
that's right, which is a very nice touch. Very eloquently put as well. It was something like, I'm glad you didn't win the race as jockey, but glad you did win it as a trainer. It was very, very well put. It was more eloquent more elegant than that. But yes, very nice touch.
And Lescargo did run one more time in the Kerry National, and that caused quite a stir.
Yes, first of all, it caused a stir at the race course because he ran so well. He was just beaten. Again, he had to carry a very heavy weight. He was one of the reasons he didn't win more races. He was a bit like Arkle. He was always carrying 2 or 3 stone more than most of his rivals, and that was certainly the case with Kerry National. So this great old national hero, and nowadays the Irish win most of our big races, but bear in mind, Lescargo was the first Irish horse to win a Grand National for 17 years. And there wasn't another Irish winner until 1999. So he was kind of a national hero, unexpectedly coming back and running in this it's sort of a mini festival type, a very sort of buoyant atmosphere. So he got this huge cheer as he was running the finish, and they were glad to see him back. But Raymond Guest, who'd gone back to America by that time, like a lot of owners, if their horse wins a Grand National, he'd taken the view that the horse didn't owe him anything. He'd already achieved so much. He wanted him retired, and he'd given him to the Moors on the understanding he'd be retired. The Moors raced him because, like a lot of race horses, they're not machined. You can't just switch them off. And they really had the feeling that Lescargo was missing racing, which may very well have been the case. So you can understand both their points of view. But actually, Raymond Guest was quite unhappy that this had happened. And he ended up taking the horse back to America. And he was, he lived in the lap of luxury for the rest of his life. But it's a bit of a shame because it meant, he didn't have 10 years of, going around Ireland being feted as a national hero, which he probably would have done had he stayed in Ireland.
Yes, because in the Kerry National, he was riding in Mrs. Joan Moore's colours, not the chocolate and pale blue colours of Raymond Guest.
Not the chocolate and pale blue, which, yeah, absolutely. So who knows? I saw Arthur Moore, Dan's son, interviewed just this weekend about the race. He said, there's no reason why he couldn't have won the Grand National again. Well, I'm not sure about that, but it would have been interesting if they'd taken each other on again in 76. My goodness.
Is he a forgotten horse? He's the only other horse apart from Golden Miller to win the Cheltenham Gold Cup and the Grand National. And
he certainly doesn't get the kudos that he deserves. I think partly because he was so soon after Arkle. And he wasn't, something like Arkle had or at least human beings perceived that he had a character. How do you know what's going on inside a horse's head? But he had this presence about him, Arkle, from other horses. And Lescargo, by all accounts, really didn't. He just sort of, arrived at the racecourse and got on with the job, sort of thing. So possibly it's partly because of that. Yeah, as I say, when I was thinking about doing this, I was just amazed that nobody had written a book about him. So I think he is a forgotten horse. Yeah.
I think you said he ran at the Cheltenham Festival, was it 8 times, 9 times?
8 times, yeah. 8 times. Won 3. Second once, I think. And fourth a couple of times. Maybe second twice. He ran. The last 2 times, they were basically just warm-ups for the Grand National. He ran in short races that they knew he wouldn't feature in, but it was just to sharpen him up for entry. So you can almost discount the last 2 times. The only reason the penultimate, the 7th time he ran at Cheltenham is important is because it was the first time he wore blinkers. Moors were related to probably the preeminent jump racing family in America called the Smithics, and some American horses that they were associated with, like Inkslinger, were coming over and running in Britain at that time, again, because jump racing wasn't doing too well in America. And I think it was Mikey Smithick, according to Arthur Moore, saw L'escargot running and said that horse needs blinkers. So that's why he ran in blinkers for about the last 8 or 10 races of his life. It's quite interesting because most people, if they do have a memory of L'escargot, I find it invariably involves him wearing these, I think, rather unsightly blue blinkers that he had on. But he only wore them last year and a bit of his career. It's quite interesting.
I thought what summed up his remarkable career was a spell in 1970 when he ran in the Cheltenham Gold Cup in the March, and then in the October he ran in the Irish Cesarewitch, November the Colonial Cup, which we talked about earlier, and then in December he ran in the Irish Sweeps Hurdle, and obviously carrying big weights in all those races.
He was amazingly versatile. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I rate him so highly. I mean, that happened mainly because of money. The Colonial Cup was incredibly rich purse. I think even though he only came fourth, I think that was one of the biggest wins money-wise in his career. The Irish Sweeps Hurdle was also a very rich race. That's why some chasers went in for it. The Cesarewitch he ran in because, as I say, they knew that US jump racing was run at a faster pace because the jumps were easy. So they wanted to sharpen him up but he ran in 2 Cesarewitches. But quite a lot of future Irish national hunt horses ran in the Cesarewitch in those days, even once they'd already started. It wasn't as unusual as you might think. It's quite a good test of stamina, I suppose. It's a very interesting period for racing because in Europe, there was a lot of money coming in. It's the time when corporate sponsorship by drinks and tobacco companies was starting. So there were a lot of interesting new initiative spurred by corporate money in Britain and Ireland at that time. So it's quite an interesting. This win he had, the first win he had at Haydock Park. That was another sort of new event where the guy whose idea it was, he wanted to try and replicate knockout football. He staged heats, if you like, around the country at different race courses, where if you came in the first 4, you qualified for the grand final at Haydock Park. So that was another, new initiative. Racing was full of them in the early 70s.
One horse he rode or raced against, you're going to tell me how many times. You've mentioned the horse earlier in the podcast, but Spanish Steps, how many times did he race against Spanish Steps?
10. Yeah, which when you get that sort of rivalry, I mean, it's the closest you get really to, the sort of, co-overt, I suppose, the matchups that you occasionally get in human sport. I mean, he usually had Spanish Steps measure, but of course, because racing is a sport with involved handicapping, i.e. trying to set the conditions so you get close finishes, it's hard to be you can be sure that pound for pound, L'escargot was a better horse than Spanish Steps, but the conditions pertaining on the day, you could never quite be sure. I think it ended up 8-2 or something in L'escargot's favour.
Well, hopefully your book, No Snail, will mean that he's not as forgotten a horse as perhaps he has been. How have reviews been going for the book?
Pretty good, I think, because of the. I've Foynaven before. I think I'm now a known quantity, so people knew what to expect for good or bad. So yes, I hope so. I actually, with the 50th anniversary of his Grand National win coming up in a couple of years, that'll probably help as well. I mean, help him to be remembered is what I mean. So yes, I hope it will. He certainly deserves to be dragged out of relative obscurity.
Well, thank you very much, David, for this trip down memory lane about
absolute pleasure, Steve. Thank
about
you.
L'escargot. Thank you very much for joining me on the Paddock and the Pavilion.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
Thank you for listening to the Paddock and the Pavilion.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at The Pad and Pav. Don't forget, if you like the show, please do leave us a rating and review.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Judy was boring.
Hello.
Then Judy discovered ChumbaCasino.com.
It's my little escape.
Now Judy's the life of the party.
Oh, baby, mama's bringing home the bacon.
Whoa, take it easy, Judy. The Chumba life is for everybody. So go to ChumbaCasino.com and play over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.